Good morning. Turns out election day's kind of not over, even though it's Friday. I don't know how many of you have been near a TV or a radio this morning, but there's all kinds of things going on around the country that bear watching. Even the most casual observer of the trends in American religion has seen the numbers or seen what's going on sort of anecdotally in their own lives, in their own communities, in their own families. Even the most optimistic among us about the future of the church has to conclude that writ large as an American institution, capital T, capital C, the church, no longer speaks with the kind of authority, the kind of convening power it once did, and that our branch of the family, the Episcopal Church, faces rough headwinds in particular in the coming decades. A few months ago, during winter break from school, I was fortunate enough to be in London. My wife and I took a quick tube ride to St. Paul's Cathedral for choral evensong. If you're ever lucky enough to be around there, do definitely do it. It's amazing. The setting, the lectionary, the evening prayer, the magnificent choir were, as you might expect, all stunningly beautiful, transporting, really. And as we filed out the door of the great cathedral onto the dark London streets, I turned to my wife and smiled and said, "It's times like this when I think, thank God for making me an Episcopalian." And she, far more sensible and level-headed, and as a Jew steeped in 2,000 years of Midrash, said, "God didn't make you an Episcopalian, your parents did." And as I thought about how to talk to you all this morning about who will be in the pews at mid-century and what the challenge is for us for the rest of the 21st century, it occurs to me that both parents and God are not busily making enough Episcopalians for us to confidently and serenely look at the next 30 years and be secure about happens to a place like SSW, thousands of parish churches across the country. I wish I could tell you the news was better. There are always, of course, bright spots, places where Spirit-filled volunteers and inspired parish leaders are doing great things. However, reported in sorrow, with alarm, or with glee, depending on who's doing the reporting, each year brings new research, new surveys, new databases from groups like Pew or the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, that agree on a few big things. One, among all American adults, let's say from 18 all the way to their wake, a larger percentage every year have no religious affiliation among American adults, up drastically since as recently as 2000. Whether raised with a religion in the family home and abandoning as adults, or in fact never professing a faith identity, whether leaving abruptly after a last straw moment, or simply drifting away, a new, significantly larger percentage of people are what demographers and social scientists are increasingly calling nuns, that is, N-O-N-E, not N-U-N-S, because of early written surveys asking about religious affiliation where they simply filled out none. Makes sense. In just a handful of years, from 2007 to 2014, according to Pew, the percentage of unaffiliated adults in America rose from 16 to 23%, just in those 7 years. There are, as you might expect, regional variations, some parts of the country more affiliated than others, some drastically less, but there are now 20 states in the Union in which no religious group comprises a greater share of the population than the unaffiliated. So the unaffiliated are the largest single denomination, you might say, among adults who are resident in the state, 20 states. Now, these 20 are heavily concentrated in the West and New England. 40% of Vermonters have no religious affiliation. Oregon, Washington, Colorado, New Hampshire are among the states where Sunday morning can be generally devoted to dog walking, the paper, or a tea time. Second, as much as this trend is gaining strength across many age groups, it's most pronounced among under 30s, people who will be in their 50s in the 2050s. A majority of people born in the last decades of the 20th century say they attend religious services a few times a year at most. 36% of younger millennials born in the 90s are unaffiliated, more than 1 out of 3. In fact, among millennials now, the single largest faith group, for want of a better term, outnumbering Roman Catholics and Protestants, are no affiliation. So in every metric of religious practice used by opinion researchers, prayer, reading scripture, church attendance, giving money, saying religion is important in their lives, people born in the 80s and 90s are not just a little different from older Americans, but significantly so. The rewrite of American immigration laws in 1965 swung the axes of American origins away from a 2-century-long emphasis on Europe and toward the rest of the world. In 1950, just one of the 10 largest countries of origin for foreign-born Americans sent largely non-white immigrants to the United States. Just one out of the top 10. By 2010, 9 of the 10 largest birthplaces, home countries of foreign-born Americans, send non-white immigrants to the United States. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. 1965 changed everything, and it was only long afterward that we realized the degree to which that is true. Those post-65 changes have saved the Roman Catholic Church in America, in numerical terms. Church has other problems, but not regarding this. The 65 changes fueled the growth of Islam in America from a relatively tiny group in the early 60s of a few 100,000 congregationally affiliated people to several million today. Here in Texas, across the Sun Belt, in the giant metro areas of the West Coast and Northeast, there are Sikh gurdwaras, Buddhist and Hindu temples, taking their place in community skylines along with the more familiar soaring steeples topped by a cross. So in 2018, what's the assignment? What are we supposed to do with that information and the daunting set of numbers that undergirds it? I want you to consider the possibility that if inheritance and heritage mean less today in individual American religious choices, does that mean that we might have a shot, a convincing argument, a convincing demonstration model? Do you have to see the way we are less bound by heritage and family custom only as a single direction causative challenge, where because we are less bound, we are inevitably moving away from a personal faith? Or does that same ability for American self-invention that really came bursting forward in the post-war decades also present the possibility of a convergence toward a faith identification, a search in response to that tug, that feeling that there can be something else, that there might be something else? Can we provide to communities across the country a model of what community and commitment and a life of joy look like, that gives us a chance with people who 30 or 40 years ago never would have given us a second thought because of the boundaries, the binding of heritage and affiliation and family custom. In 1950, you might not have been able to convince a Lutheran to come to your church. He'd say, I'm not going to go to your church. I'm a Lutheran. Fast forward 50 years and talk to a 30-year-old who has no idea what the difference between an Episcopalian and a Lutheran is. Maybe the conversation is entirely different because you are no longer bound by those ideas of historic or familial affiliation. So I guess my own answer is a qualified yes, but yes. Before we even set out to do something, whatever it is, do we also have to have an inside the family conversation about how conflicted we are about evangelism? If we were to set out a more entrepreneurial path, the E word, over the next 82 years that get us to 2100, are we just climbing into the muck with toothpaste and detergent and canned soup and gasoline and thinking about this thing of ours that we think is good for us, good for the world, makes life saner, better, more coherent, heals the wounds of suffering humanity? Do we have to think of it more like a product? And if we do, are we giving something essential away in that very act of thinking of it like a product? Something that we make for ourselves and for others. How do you feel about that? Think about how you feel about that. I have to ask because I suspect that if I talk to you all individually, I'd get a lot of different answers around the room about whether there's something just in its core unsettling about thinking of the church like a product, thinking of our propositions about the world as something that we'd have to sell other people on. How comfortable are you with the idea that we have a product? In this peculiar case, a product of centuries of wondering and arguing and praying and reading and studying and arguing some more and getting on boats and planes to bring the ideas and the arguments and the propositions we make about the shape of the world to other people. How ready are we to do that in a world where we really can't even rely on getting a hearing anymore in the way we could in 1950 or 1940 or 1930? A world where our crowd might have once had the power to command, the authority to demand a certain kind of obedience, and now can only use a softer kind of power. Among the so-called mainline churches, we are having a particularly bad half-century. And there is a paradox embedded there as well, as James Twitchell points out in his bracing, entertaining, and occasionally infuriating book, Shopping for God. Young people may have terrible associations with the very term Christian. So what's the answer that the mainline church gives? Hey, we're not like that. We're not doing that stuff. So don't think of us like those other guys who do all that stuff. We're not like that. But it's turning out that we're not like that is not a sufficient answer. The churches that, it might be argued, contribute most strongly to those negative public impressions are declining too, but not as fast, interestingly, as the Presbyterian Church, the United Methodists, the United Church of Christ, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Disciples of Christ, or the American Baptists. Those churches of the made-up mind are having their troubles too. But we're in faster decline than they are. And that, for me, is where things get a little confusing. The news is full of highly politicized parts of the wider church because of the ferocious reaction to marriage equality, the cruel slanders against gay people, the antiquated ideas about gender and worship, the unforgiving harshness of the public posture of some of these churches. And again, what's our answer? We don't do that stuff here. Yet, we're in bigger trouble than the Southern Baptists. In the book Unchristian, What a New Generation Really Thinks About Christianity by David Kinnaman of the Barna Group, he looked at polling among 16 to 29-year-olds and found 3 main attributes associated by that age group with present-day American Christianity. Coming in at number 1, 91% anti-gay. Number 2 at 87%, judgmental. And number 3 at 85%, hypocritical. I've never been in marketing, but I know enough about it to know that starting out with those 3 attributes as your top 10 associations, and again, this is when you don't give them a list and say, mark these off, but say to them, you tell me what the words you associate with this identity are. And those are the 3 first terms, the 3 most frequently named terms. 7 of the top 10 words associated as descriptors were negative. I keep reading about the dissatisfaction with big box retail religion, arena-sized churches, feel-good preaching, and a happy-clappy skimming of the challenge of the Christian life. Well, we in this branch of the church demand a rigorous path to ordination, demand scholarship, training in preaching and teaching. Our prayer book has for centuries been one of the glories of the English language. We've wrestled, sometimes too publicly, with the challenges of defining what's eternal and unchanging and what demands rethinking. And it's been hard, and it's been painful, and it's been tough. And look at where we've ended up. As the last 30 years have demonstrated, there are few easy rewards that come from just being us and deciding to just continue doing what we've been doing. When I looked out at my classes at Amherst College, I saw young people, smart, engaged, curious about the world, utterly unaware and uninterested in the difference between an Episcopalian, a Methodist, a Presbyterian, and a Catholic, beyond the fact that they are labels that you could apply to their grandparents or their own great-grandparents or people down the street or people that they knew. And they don't think that they're missing a thing. They don't think they're missing anything. And that is one of the biggest challenges surrounding all of this. It's not, even though among those who are not hostile, who don't hold preconceptions that are antagonistic, to get them to be part of us even briefly, you have to get over that threshold that they don't want us, they don't need us, and they don't think they're missing a thing. In my spring semester class, one of my students included this passage in an essay. Quote, "To me, someone who thinks there could be a higher power but isn't interested in finding a place of worship that feels good, someone who's very much still that 5-year-old who would get bored and whine during church, someone that a church may target their ads at, it simply doesn't seem effective. You might be able to convince me that I need a new smartphone or super healthy water or GMO-free salmon, But how are you going to convince me that I need your brand of religion? Your religion is judgment-free? Cool. Your church is fancy and comfortable? Cool. I don't really care. Unless you can offer me something amazing, like weekly meetings with Jesus himself, there's nothing you can say that will make me or any other potential customers want to come to your service every week. So who are you actually selling to? Smart kid, a freshman. Later in the assignment, he concluded, religion with a big R, that is, religion as an institution from an outsider's perspective, looks to be doomed. So what's the assignment? What are both history and the demand of the present age insisting we do now? On one level, you're already doing it. You're here, and you're trying to figure out the answers to just those questions. You're keeping the candles lit and the buildings heated, the doors open, and continuing to welcome all who want to be a part of this thing. That's at least the beginning of a plausible answer for a place of worship vying for attention in a broad marketplace no longer defined by custom and family history. Episcopalians did not run west to chase the moving frontier as many other churches did. It's a historic mistake, but we can't get a do-over for 1825. It happened. We didn't do it. We're reaping those historic trends today, but we don't get a do-over. Which means realistically that simply continuing to do what we do and doing it really well is not in and of itself going to be enough. In the near term is the first imperative to hold fast to what we've got, solidify and stabilize before stepping out into a less receptive, more hostile culture to preach and teach. There is an inverse relationship, broadly speaking, between church affiliation and education. And I say broadly speaking because obviously every Sunday morning in America sees very lightly educated people sleeping in and exquisitely educated people heading into a pew somewhere. So obviously it's not a one-to-one correlation. But in general terms, the more educated you are, the less likely you are to be congregationally affiliated. Episcopalians are among a handful of small American religious groups, Jews, Hindus, Unitarians, and us, the big small four, at the top of the table of average years of schooling. There is also an inverse relationship between family size and education. So we're in great shape. Well-educated, good earners, not having so many kids, and when you don't have so many kids, you really can't afford to lose that many to the secular world. We put a huge emphasis on getting our kids exquisitely educated, which on average is going to mean that they marry people of similar education level and give you very few grandchildren, playing out the demographic trends. And those grandchildren are more likely to spend Sunday morning with bagels in the Sunday Times, even in Austin, than they are with the 1982 hymnal. In the eye-opening journey among America's nuns, written by religion professor Elizabeth Drescher, Choosing My Religion, this scholar of American religion noticed something interesting. A lot of young adults raised in the church, when you ask them about their current lives in their 20s and 30s, they held no hostility for the institution. They didn't leave in a huff. Many valued deeply what they were taught. Over time, they didn't stomp out, they just drifted out the door. My daughter is an Episcopal priest working in Manhattan. They have a 20s and 30s ministry at her church, a busy, lively congregation within a congregation. A lot of the members of that grouping are new to town, brought to New York by work or school, looking for connection and community, and finding it by either coming in from another branch of the church or returning to the church home of their childhood without having to get married and have kids to do it. Many of you are old enough to remember the assurances that vestry members and rectors and congregational leaders all gave each other that, oh, don't worry. Yes, we lose them when they leave for college, but then they come back when they get married and have children. But the more educated you are, the more likely you are to get married later and later. And those kids come later and later too. So instead of this being a small pause in your adult formation, it ends up being an entire life passage from 18 to 30 or 18 to 32, where you've very happily moved on without the church. The age at first marriage has been rising in the same 50 years as the Episcopal Church has been shrinking. I told my son when he left for college that I would never order him. I would never tell him he had to go to church. I would never even ask him to go to church. After bringing him myself every Sunday for his whole life, he was leaving Washington to go to the University of Chicago. It's not just institutions that have declining authority. Fathers have declining authority as well. I pointed out that moving to a new place and living among thousands of strangers is hard, and that if he wanted to find people who he knew and got and recognized right away, and got him in return, the Episcopal chaplaincy on campus, and the University of Chicago happens to have a terrific one, would offer him instant community with peers who he would immediately recognize as people like himself. It worked. He was active all 4 years. He was the elected student leader of the ministry in his senior year. And years later, now, as he's knocking on the door of 30, he's not altogether sure there's a God, but he still goes to church. Because, he told me, what's taught there reaches him, touches him, challenges him, and he still likes that. And he also loves the hymnal. And a church with a praise band and a pastor in Dockers just can't compare with that. When I was the keynote speaker a few years ago at the Diocesan Convention of the Diocese of Massachusetts, one rector came up to me after the talk and said, "Oh, you're worrying too much. As long as Roman Catholics keep marrying Methodists, we're going to be okay." But I found that a very unsatisfactory observation at the time, and it's even less so today. That's not going to be enough. The largest single self-description among the nuns is spiritual but not religious. How exactly should we reach a 25-year-old? Somebody who went to church, maybe is new to town or returning to a community after leaving for college. Just keep on doing the good work of being us, and the ones that find us, sort of leave it to chance and circumstance. Make intentional outreach to young people trying to craft something that answers that need, but doesn't feel too churchy? Is there a way of offering radical welcome, saying we don't care so much about your ecclesiastical resume, whether you have ever sat through a catechism class, went to vacation Bible school, or even if your parents had you baptized? At least at the beginning, come as you are. Come as who you are. We can work with whatever shape you're in when you hit the front door. Seeker, sinner, fellow traveler. It's probably a strength that our barriers to entry are low. The Bishop of Washington, Marianne Budde, has suggested that if the way we do our Episcopal thing operates as a barrier to people trying to connect with the essence of who we are, that if we're more concerned with bringing people to Jesus, we need to be a little less concerned with fights over prayer book language. But that's a tough straddle too, and it's easy to say, but every time I talk to somebody who gushes to me about the glories of our liturgy, I think, well, it might be a little risky to push some of that stuff aside, the stuff that people love. Not people who are strangers to us, but the people who are actually already inside the door, say they love. Are we going to just sort of set it out in the hopes, in the possibility of having a door that's open wider to people who are still outside? It's a tough one. That's a really tough one. If 500 years of accumulated wealth of liturgy is a balm and a blessing for some and a barrier for others, obviously we do have to think about, debate about, ask ourselves about what's more important. And the bishop knows when she says that I have my doubts. It's tough to thread the needle in such a way as to stay close to the people who are already with you and love you, and find a way to be different to people who are trying to find their way to you. We used to have some measure of confidence that a share of people who had either grown up without a church or drifted away in young adulthood would find their way back somehow through the urging of a more church-affiliated spouse, or a couple's conviction that some religion was a good thing in some abstract kind of way to hand on to a child, even though they weren't so sure about it themselves. With the share of unaffiliated people so much higher among young adults, that confidence is not well placed, just in numerical terms. Just by the rigid demands of mathematics, more young couples having their first children will both be not only unchurched, but completely uninterested in what we do. Which is not to say there's unremitting hostility to religion. Many of the nuns, according to Drescher, should really more accurately be called sums than nuns. There is a lifelong deposit of a worldview, of a sense of right morality and what living in community means that was put there by early religious instruction. And a lot of the sums have fashioned an adult faith from childhood instruction and the things they've taken on board in their lives. Catholicism minus church plus meditation, Jewish customs plus Buddhist practice, living room hymn sings, secular sing-ins with friends, communally prepared and shared dinners in which they feel they touch something sacred. But it's less programmatic and less dogmatic than what they think of as church. Drescher calls it the 4 F's: family, friends, food, and Fido. There might be an opening to the millions of sums, giving us a shot that we really don't have, honestly, with the nuns. Many of the sums feel like they were pushed out as much as left. The church, writ large, has left a lot of wounded people on the battlefield. People who have really been wounded by everything from outright cruelty to simple neglect. People who put their trust in leaders who let them down. Our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, calls us part of the Jesus movement. And that's a movement that I think is a winner. I think if you put it that way, a lot of people might consider something that they hadn't considered before. And I can be a part of that movement with people who are very different from me and in the movement for different reasons. The stuff will sort out over the long haul. One of the frequent complaints of young Americans raised as mainline Protestants, part of the explanation for why they were no longer affiliated, was one of the things I had long since thought of as a strength. So this was kind of a surprise to me. The very thing that I thought of as a strength, the church year itself. And it's constantly renewing, cyclical, marching on. Turns off young adults who say, well, yeah, I know that. I heard it last year, and 2 years before that, and 3 years before that. As a matter of fact, I've heard it the whole time I've been growing up. So here it comes again. That doesn't do anything for me. It's Lent again, so what? So just shows you how wrong a guy can be. You know, I'm sitting there thinking, oh, this is phenomenal. And it may be because I'm Puerto Rican, so there's a deeply ingrained idea about Las Posadas and processions and outward displays of piety in the streets of towns, processions carrying santos from the church into the town square, all that stuff that is a constantly renewing resource actually turns them off. I heard that story, got the lesson, so I'm good now, and I don't have to keep coming back to hear it. Young people who didn't leave in a huff, didn't have a last straw moment, didn't angrily march out, told some of the scholars my class read this term that they loved and valued what the church taught them about how to live, about how to be a good person, about how to treat the people around them. And that was it. One and done. They're good. They think they're good. They're done. So maybe for all the off-the-charts scholastic achievements of Anglicans in America, we are kind of slow because we are missing that part of the story. So instead of hearing the Great Commission and saying, okay, I've got it, and I don't have to come back and hear it again and again, we actually think words are very important, maybe sometimes too important. But we do think words are important. If you think about the last 40 years of our history, they're so important that even after decades of not hearing them regularly and never saying them myself out loud because they were meant to be said by others, I can still start with the opening sentences of Rite One Eucharist and take you through the whole thing. And I'm not that smart. It's just in there. Ye who do truly and earnestly repent you of your sins and are in love and charity with your neighbors and intend to lead a new life following the commandments of God and walking from henceforth in his holy ways. Draw near with faith. Take this holy sacrament to your comfort. What was good and useful about hearing those words again and again and again? Even as a kid, I was being asked to think about what it would mean to be in love and charity with my neighbors. Brooklyn in the late 1960s was a difficult place to be in love and charity with your neighbors. Who were my neighbors? Was it some of the people who were, in fact, looking for new places to live because my family now lived in their neighborhood? Were they my neighbors? Did I intend to lead a new life? The one I had was actually still pretty new at that point. If I wasn't feeling particularly faithful in that moment, that particular Sunday morning, should I draw near with faith anyway? I was 10 years old, and I knew what succor and vouchsafe and unfeignedly meant. Arguably useful when taking the SAT, not something that you normally use in other parts of your life. We fight about words. It might be a luxury we have to learn to do without as our buildings continue to empty out. And our family fights about words might seem very strange to the share of unaffiliated adults who decide they don't need to hear them at all anymore. And while we're looking ahead more than 30 years, looking ahead to the end of the century, maybe we should also be thinking about who's going to be in the pulpit. The church's own internal state of the clergy report shows retirements outpacing ordinations by 43%, fewer young ordinations, and more older ones, meaning the age distribution is dangerously skewed toward retirement. Overall, ordinations have fallen by 31% in recent decades, and hiding in the data, an interesting development, 30% of all ordinations are now to the permanent diaconate. A smaller church is already in the process of turning to the clerical equivalent of the National Guard to shore up the ranks in cassocks. Are deacons a sign of what's to come as the church right-sizes as an institution? A Presbyterian publication recently called full-time pastors with no outside employment an endangered species. One study found a majority of ordination-bound divinity school graduates had $40,000 in education debt at graduation, even as they headed into congregations less able to employ them full-time, less able to help them pay down the bills accumulated while getting this training for this life. The Protestant denominations that are shrinking have the most rigorous and lengthy processes for becoming ordained clergy. Seems to be a market mismatch there. They require extensive education, the talents of a scholar, teacher, counselor, liturgist, CFO, and CEO. And yet churches continue to ask for a lot in return for a promise of sometimes only a little. Being entrepreneurial is going to mean some tough, difficult, and for a lot of people, sad choices. We're going to have to close places, merge some, reimagine some, rebuild others. The church but not church, those new places currently being developed around the country, are trying to meet people where they are instead of standing aloof and waiting until they take it upon themselves to show up. In Brooklyn, St. Lydia's Dinner Church is doing something interesting. On Sunday and Monday evenings, the doors are thrown open, people welcomed in, worship conducted around the dinner table. There's prayer, conversation, and music. St. Lydia's is led by ordained people, Lutherans as it happens, who are consciously connecting their practice to the practice of the early church. But in their pitch to the curious, it's clear that they're stepping back from being too programmatic, too creedal, too churchy. They say in part, if you're not sure what you believe, rest assured, neither are we. We place practice before belief, trusting that the practice of eating, praying, and singing together that moves us deeper into faith. Instead of trying to figure out what we would believe, we're trying to live what we practice. I'm dying to get to St. Lydia's Dinner Church. First of all, I hear the food's good, but also I want to see this experiment as it goes on. They are getting enough money through the door to keep providing the program and the ministry, but it has to live with constant subsidy from that synod. It's not self-sustaining yet. But in the design, there's a clear intention to build down the experience, to make the on-ramp as shallow as possible, reassuring the person who's considering joining that there's not a lot of prior knowledge required. At the same time, trying to be welcoming, informal, and intimate. If you go to the website, it instructs, at the dinner table, we invite you to simply engage those around you in normal old things. Where are you from? How long have you lived in New York? What are you up to this week? I want to see this place, and I will get there. There's an after-work drop-in Episcopal church in the South Loop in Chicago, right near the Board of Trade. It's got a homemade liturgy feel, bottom-up, not top-down. But when my son was recently transferred back to Chicago by his company, and I suggested Grace Place, my agnostic Episcopalian son said, Oh, I've been there. Grace Place is a little too loosey-goosey for me. So you can find orthodoxy in the least expected places, even among people who aren't so sure that there's a God. So let 1,000 flowers bloom. In the long span of history, we may look back and realize that the best thing that ever happened to us was the removal of the social sanction and the pressure to conform that kept a lot of people coming when they didn't want to be here anymore. So when we throw open the doors for the dance, there'll be people there who really want to dance. And we'll still be here in 2100. I just hope that it's for the best of reasons and not because we're scared of the world that we've made for ourselves to live in, so scared that we'll be clinging to each other for comfort and reassurance. Let's embrace it rather than flee to those open doors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ray. We have some time for questions, and I'd also like to mention to you all that both of Ray's presentations have been filmed and will be put up on the SSW website. So if anyone would like to share these wonderful presentations with your congregations or with your colleagues, please consider doing so. Do we have a URL for that yet? Do we know? We don't know yet, but it'll be up on the SSW website, so please make note of that, and we'll get that information out to you ASAP. And Kathy's got a mic too, so any questions?
Ray, I was intrigued by your comment about having a low ramp of membership and not a lot of obstacles. Warren, what's his first name? Purpose-Filled Church.
Mm-hmm. Rick Warren.
Rick Warren talks about having a steep requirement for membership, requiring classes before you can call yourself a member and a lot of different things. And that church is growing numerically, or at least it was. I don't know about it anymore. And that seems a disconnect.
I go back and forth about this myself. My inclination to believe that we have a better chance with people that we can actually see and get through the door than ones that we hold at arm's length comes into play. But at the same time, if you are so undefined that you become undefinable, well, what is it that that they've just cleared this shallow on-ramp into entry for? If there's nothing we agree on, if we're so afraid of orthodoxy that we don't want to talk about what we believe and what we don't believe and all of that, then why are we even bothering? So there's a tension at the core of that for me as someone who wants to see healthy congregations and also recognizes the outlines of the marketplace as it really exists. I would venture a guess that the profile of a new member of one of Rick Warren's churches is different from the profile of a new member of one of our churches. I think also places like the Willow Creeks and similar places have a much bigger churn problem than they are comfortable discussing publicly. So yes, if next Sunday we went to Buttonwood Baptist Church in Plano, and there's 3,000 seats, and all 3,000 of them are full, and we go back a year later, and the 3,000 seats are full, it's not the same 3,000 people. So you will either glom onto the fact that all 3,000 seats are full, or you'll glom onto the fact that it's a whole new cast of characters. There's a big, big churn problem in the megachurches. So being rigorous on the front end is no guarantee of longitudinal affiliation, it turns out. And I understand the temptation for it. One of the gross and exaggerated knocks on our community is that we don't stand for anything or believe in anything. If you've been part of us for any length of time, that's like silly as a proposition. If you listen to the preaching and teaching of the church year in and year out, you know that that's not true, but it is one of the most consistently heard knocks on the Episcopal Church. So our openness, our willingness to remain close to people who aren't necessarily ready to buy every every jot and line and piece of punctuation in the Nicene Creed is seen by many as a weakness rather than a strength. So I know that that's not a satisfying answer, but I do go back and forth about that, because if we can get people to listen, some share of them, some subset of them, will hang in. If we put up barriers at the front door, do a faith biopsy at the front door, we may have not as much of a good chance with a lot of those people. Because some people are convinced over time, too. Yeah. Not after they clear that shallow ramp to entry. It's being in encounter that gives them the buy-in over time. Yeah.
Something you kind of alluded to that I'm constantly thinking about in my ministry that I'd be interested to hear your comments is we ride this difficult balance of how do we sustain the people who are currently in our church while inviting others in, and oftentimes there's generational and economic differences to where if I want to proclaim a gospel that is open, affirming, welcoming, and issues of immigration, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, etc., it's going to off-put the members who have the money, to just be vulgar. And
honest.
And honest. So how do we, and pastorally, how do I love and care for at the same time? And I see this playing out in small levels and on large levels. Look at the number of LGBT rectors as opposed to associates. You will find very few in the state of Texas with the various dioceses.
No kidding.
So how does that work?
Some of this is geography, some of it is historical legacy, some of it is just public association with who we are, but there are churches that are not, and there are more all the time because of the way neighborhoods in metropolitan areas have changed. There are places that are really talking to and providing ministry to people very different from the ones who built the place in the first place. Mm-hmm. And I see that very strongly in my hometown of Brooklyn, which is a place where the map has been redrawn and rewritten and torn up and redrawn again over and over and over. The people in the columbarium would be shocked by the people in the pews. But they are rarely there at the same time, alive and vertical and passing the peace to each other. I was just recently at a national conference on parish vitality, and one of the main takeaways that all these people, clerics and volunteers and lay leaders, and we sat in a room all day and hammer and tongs all day, and one of the main takeaways that was written up on the whiteboard when we were getting ready to leave was, let's stop apologizing for being who we are. That was considered like job one. And the thing that was funny about that is that all day we talked about the real live structural and cultural impediments to being able to reach out and embrace large numbers of people who wouldn't think of us normally. But we had to stop acting as if we could have a do-over for 1850. I can't fix the Leonidas K. Polk problem. It is what it is. When I was at Sewanee a couple of years ago to give a commencement talk, his vestments were framed and up on the wall, and I stayed in what had been for a time his home. And I thought, well, all right, Leonidas and I probably wouldn't see eye to eye on a great many things. But I can't change him, and he can't do anything about me, and we're still both Episcopalians and tough. There is a wonderful book by the author Jonathan Kozol called Ordinary Resurrections, which I know you guys have a lot to read all the time. But this wonderful book takes us into the life of a parish in the poorest zip code in America, in Hunts Point in the South Bronx. A tough, tough area. And the Episcopal Church that was built by a Western European descended middle-class congregation in the late years of the 19th century is now home to a Caribbean, almost entirely non-white congregation, has services in 3 languages, and is a vital presence and a beacon in that neighborhood in ways that are fundamentally similar to what it was when it was first built by the people who loved the place in the first place. We can master the trick of being more things to more people. I'm going to hedge my bets. I'm not going to say all things to all people, but more things to more people. We are, when I go to diocesan conventions, when I go to meetings that are far more diverse than what I would have seen at, Cathedral Day when I was a kid. And, we would all get on buses and go to Queens, and everybody would march around with their banner, and that was a very different Episcopal Church from the one that I see today, unremarkably, normally, week in and week out as I travel the country. Spanish-speaking congregations in Southern California and in the border counties of the United States, in South Florida. The diocese is sending my daughter to get her serviceable Spanish up to preaching level next year, so she's going down to Cuernavaca in Mexico. I hope this will not give her a Mexican accent as opposed to a Puerto Rican one, but if that happens, it will be in the service of the kingdom, so it'll be okay. But, we do a lot of hand-wringing, a tremendous amount of hand-wringing. We could probably light a small city with the energy, the heat that's thrown off by all our hand-wringing about some of these things, about inclusion and about openness and all that. We are organically doing a lot of things right. And along with the self-flagellation, we should just encourage the things that are going right to continue going right. I'm not sure that answers your question, but it's what occurs to me in response to what you had to say. Yeah.
Just one quick housekeeping thing. Eric tells me that this lecture can be found at ssw.edu/Suarez lecture. I think we have time for just one more question.
Having self-identified as like a really old priest yesterday, I just want to offer perspective for the comment about in this diocese especially, there are some women associates, but very few rectors. That's true in...
And LGBTQ.
Oh, sorry, LGBT. I'm sorry. Well, I shifted gears because I'm so old that there are two parts of my answer. One is that at my first diocesan convention, before most people in this room were born, and certainly most students in the room were born, the great fight was over women. In 1978, and the secondary fight, the subtext that people didn't really even want to acknowledge was the fight over LGBTQ. And the fight was, where are they allowed in the church? No question about would they be ordained at that point, but how do we treat them in the church? And there were some great General Convention resolutions that helped us along the way. Some of them you read back on them now and you're embarrassed by the language, but they were such progress at the time that we were the radical church that people thought were crazy. And, by the way, unchristian. I came out of Texas, so let me tell you, you can be told how unchristian you are in a real hurry. But I just want to say that, and it may seem like a really long time for some of you in the room, but in the 40 years that I have been ordained, we have gone from a place where there were no women rectors or associates to a woman presiding bishop. And where people of color in the church, in the Episcopal Church, were sort of an anomaly. It was cute and marvelous that we had some, to having Michael Curry as the next presiding bishop. And the issue of where people are now in the structure as LGBTQ clergy and lay leaders is a place where we need to be working on really, really hard. But the fact that there are people that are in those positions at all is, in the great span of 2,000 years of Christian history, an almost miraculous turnaround in time. And I just want to be encouraging about the fact that we're going to get other places much faster than it took us for this. But because I think the progression rolls along. And there are prices to pay in terms of the people in my parishes that we've lost because we've become too liberal. And I tend to think too sanctified. But don't be discouraged by the fact that there is progress that must still be made and it doesn't seem fast enough. I know it isn't fast enough, but it's in the great roll of time. I think it's pretty miraculous to be where we are right now.
Thank you so much. Ray, I'd like to give you an opportunity to offer your reflections on those comments, and I also want to put you on the spot and see whether you would be willing to close us in prayer after your final reflections.
Okay. One's easier than the other. Now that I have a close family member in the business, I pay attention to some of these things more closely than I used to. And yes, while there is a tremendous change in really just the blink of an eye, it is also true that if you are a woman associate, you are far more likely than a man to be called to your next church as an associate again, while your male peers, even from your own seminary graduating class, have their next jobs as a rector. There's still a kind of stickiness to women's aspirations that we'll address over time, I'm sure. In American workplace history, it's been illustrated again and again that when a job transitions from being a male-dominated job to being a female-dominated job, the pay goes down and the status goes down for the job. It would be good if, as we think about our to-do list for the next 50 years, if we don't let that happen to this particular job. I would hate to see a pink ghettoization of that really is a betrayal of what it meant to open up the ordained ministry to women in the first place. So yeah, sure, we got a long way to go, but I see all kinds of good things happening too. My daughter's boss has been the rector of one of the largest congregations in the Diocese of New York for over 20 years. And while there were people on the front end who were, and it kind of scrambles my eggs to even think about it, but they were openly and unashamedly unhappy and said so about the fact that that church had called a woman rector. Crazy, but okay. Now, you know, it just seems as natural as anything else that happens there, and unremarkable. So, when I was at the cathedral in Havana, that was one of those moments where I thought, we're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. We were using the Spanish translation of the Book of Common Prayer, and during communion, a bunch of the older women of the church, who actually could remember what that church was before the revolution, got up and phonetically sang hymns in English during communion, so the choir could take communion. It was one of those weird, wonderful moments where you thought, you know, the Italians have a saying, you know, you lay out this litany of all the terrible things that are happening, and there's this, and there's this, and there's this, but they always conclude, ma pur si muova, and yet somehow it still moves. And that's how I think of our thing. We can spend a lot of time talking about the problems and the challenges and the impediments to where we need to get to, ma pur si muova. It still moves, and we are on the move, and it's going to be okay. Now, part 2 of your request. Dear Lord, whose glory we see daily in each other and in creation, all of creation, make us Jesus' hands in the world to lift up, to comfort, to reassure, to heal, to make whole. Let us live out the assignment, the lifelong assignment you've given us to be your people in the world, and let people know who we are by how we live. Amen.